If the US wanted to take control of Kharg Island, the blunt option really is to bombard it from the air and with missiles and basically smash it up and deny it to the Iranians. It's very hard to predict what President Trump will do, and that's one of his great strengths, is his unpredictability. If an intact regime remains in place, then they remain a threat. They remain a threat to America, to Israel, and to other Arab countries in the region. If the US wanted to take control of Kharg Island, there are two options really. And the first one, the blunt option really, is to bombard it from the air and with missiles and basically smash it up and deny it to the Iranians. And of course, it's very important to Iran because it's a key installation for its export of oil and gas. And that would obviously have an immediate effect, wouldn't involve troops on the ground, but would have the major disadvantage that it would then deny that facility in the long term. And I think the United States doesn't have an interest in completely disabling Iran. I think hopefully with a view to a future regime which is less hostile to the United States and its allies and to Middle Eastern countries. I don't think it wants to completely deny it of its economic capability, which I think this would make a major contribution to. So the second option is to capture it using probably using US Marines or other military forces to land on the island and take control of it with a military force. Now, we're not talking about here, because it's not a huge place and it's separate from the Iranian mainland. We're not talking about a need for very large numbers of troops. We're talking about relatively small forces that could do it. And I think it would be comparatively easy for the United States forces to take over the island and get control of it. There could be attempts by the Iranians to bombard the American forces on the island from using their rockets and drones, etc. But of course, the Americans would have very effective air defenses, which would deploy as part of the force, and they've got their airborne air defenses as well. So I don't think it would be a particularly difficult operation for America to accomplish. It wouldn't involve huge numbers of troops, and it could be done maybe for a limited period of time. Well, I think it would be a one step in undermining the current Iranian regime's economy. It's a pretty critical place, and it would probably be carried out in conjunction with attacks on other elements of Iranian energy infrastructure, etc. So, and very clearly, the Iranians have been fairly resilient in the face of pretty wide-scale US and Israeli attacks. But their key vulnerability, that's not to say they haven't been badly damaged, because they have. They've been very badly damaged, and their military strength is now a tiny fraction of what it once was. But I think their main vulnerability, which they might find it more difficult to withstand, is economic pressure. The economy is already in a desperate state. It was before the war began. It's become even more so since the war, both from military action and also from President Trump's blockade of Iranian ports and his increased sanctions regime. So this is their key. I think this is their key vulnerability. And I don't believe it would take a huge amount to push them over the edge if there was sufficient focus on either destroying or denying their use of so much of their energy capabilities. I think Kharg Island is one of his cards. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the most important card or the last card he has to play. I think there's a great deal that he can do as this situation unfolds further. And he's very clearly trying to achieve what he wants with Iran without further military force, if he can. And I think that's an understandable situation, but I think it's also an optimistic situation, because if an intact regime, no matter what great deal they sign up to, if an intact regime remains in place, then they remain a threat. They remain a threat to America, to Israel, and to other Arab countries in the region. Because whatever they agree to do or not do, Iran will never adhere to any agreement for any longer than it sees it useful to itself. So they can't be relied upon to stick to anything that they sign up to. And everything, if any part of any agreement that is the basis for a longer-term peace settlement has to be both verifiable by the United States and enforceable by United States actions if necessary. I think it's very hard to predict what President Trump will do, and that's one of his great strengths, is his unpredictability. So I don't think it's really possible to estimate, for example, how long he's prepared to let this play out before he returns to the fight with Iran. I think one factor which may be relevant, may not be, is the World Cup going on now in the United States. And it may be that he doesn't want to get back into a high-intensity conflict while the World Cup's running. So it may be that Iran has that sort of breathing space, and then after that, perhaps they need to be looking a bit more cautiously. And it sounds ridiculous when you're talking about war being dictated by sport, but it's one of the realities of the modern world. I think it's possible that Iran might, with great reluctance, agree to the terms that Trump is laying down, and that might include, I think the first real step of his negotiations, more than anything else, involved the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. And that would be, I think he would see that probably as being a pretty significant gain in the wake of the military campaign. Then following on from that, we might see a focus on the nuclear program and Iran surrendering its nuclear material and agreeing not to carry out any further nuclear development. I think that's going to be more difficult to get to. I think Iran's going to be very reluctant to allow, for example, its existing highly enriched uranium, such as it is, to be removed from Iran. Yeah, they might sign up to an agreement on restricting their nuclear project, but as I mentioned before, really, that can't be taken as being something you could kind of stake your life on. I think they can sign it and then just do whatever they want to do. In particular, I think there'd probably be a gap. If this did occur, and I'm not optimistic it will, but if it did occur, there may well be a gap between Iran signing up to a nuclear deal and then actually reneging on it. And that reneging is probably going to be calculated to come after President Trump's term of office is over, in the hope that whoever takes over from him will have a less, shall we say, belligerent perspective on these things. I think Iran is, we shouldn't think about Iranian thinking, shall I say, in the same way as we think about our thinking. You know, many countries, having been subjected to massive American and Israeli military power, might want to cut their losses and at least do no further provocation of the Americans or indeed the Israelis. But that's not really in Iran's thinking. Their major issue, their major concern is not the lives of their own people or the well-being of their own people. The major concern is the preservation and the survival of the Iranian Islamic regime. That's top of their list. And not very far below that, probably at least on a level, is their obsession with honor and with their real horror of being humiliated. And that's why we hear a lot of big talk, and it's why we hear Trump saying we're close to a deal and them saying we're nowhere near a deal. We haven't got anywhere near it. They want to be seen to be in the driving seat as far as they possibly can be. So I think that's what's behind their thinking. As we've seen with the Americans, they're willing to offer some form of negotiation. Now, to the Iranian regime, that is weakness. The Iranians will never negotiate unless they become defeated. And they do see American offers at negotiation, American offers at holding out the olive branch, so to speak, as being a big sign of weakness for the Americans, which they then immediately will seize on and try and exploit. That is their thinking. And I don't think there's ever been a case where the Iranians have agreed to negotiations without certainly without their own defeat, or in the case of their enemies' defeat. I think they believe in fighting to the death. I think the Gulf states were probably taken aback by the extent of aggression by the Iranian regime against them. They've always feared Iran. They've always feared Iranian aggression, but I think they were rather surprised when it came home to them. And there's no doubt that they will be working particularly hard on two fronts, really. One, I think to persuade President Trump to finish this regime off, and particularly that's the case in the UAE. But secondly, to defend themselves more effective than they have up to now. So America will have a role in this, in supporting these countries with missile defense and drone defenses, as will Israel. And Israel is, as we know, Israel deployed a battery of Iron Dome to the UAE. And Israel, behind the scenes, has been extremely helpful to the Gulf states and will continue to do so. And I think that's the key point is, unless a regime is put in place in Iran that is less hostile to its Arab neighbors and to Israel and the US, then this threat is going to be maintained. It's going to continue, and all of the states in the region are going to have to defend themselves against it.
Too long to get to a deal. I want to make sure I quote you correctly. You said that now they will have to pay the price. Yeah. What did you mean by that specifically?
Well, we're going to be attacking them very hard.
Resuming bombing?
Yeah, well, we are. Based on the helicopter, I guess we have the right to do that. They shot down a very incredible machine.
I think there's a great deal of posturing going on from the Iranian regime, but as we saw with the downing of the Apache helicopter, and as we've seen with them firing missiles at Israel and also firing missiles recently at other Gulf countries, they're not finished. They're not. I think they've been very badly damaged. Their nuclear program has been thrown out. It's still there. There's still the remnants. They still have the capability of resurrecting it, with the help probably of countries like Russia and China. And the same goes really for their ballistic missile and drone capability. They still have capability. It's been very badly written down. They have already, since the war, the recent war this year, they've been working on rebuilding their air defenses, their missile capability, their drone capability. So I don't say they've necessarily come anywhere near back to the were at the beginning. They're far from that. But it's a matter of time until they do. I think if they're allowed to, then we will see Iran going back towards its pre-war capabilities. And that will be done with the assistance of both China and Russia. I think the most dangerous development in this current round of negotiations would be if President Trump decided to link the conflict in Lebanon to Iran, which is obviously what the Iranians want. Hezbollah is their number one proxy. They've seen their number two proxy, Hamas, very badly damaged and probably on the verge of being finished off altogether. And therefore they're very keen to try and maintain Hezbollah as a significant proxy to use against Israel. And so they want the two things linked. They want to stop Israeli action against Hezbollah in Lebanon. That would be, if that was to happen, that would be quite catastrophic, because Israel must be given the latitude that it needs to prevent its northern communities from being attacked by Hezbollah rockets, drones, etc., which would certainly happen if Israel, for example, had to withdraw from its current security zone inside Lebanon before sufficient damage was done to Hezbollah. And hopefully, but wouldn't be optimistic, before the Lebanese armed forces themselves take on and neutralize Hezbollah. I think that's an aspiration, perhaps, but I don't think it's overly realistic. I think it's really down to the Israelis to deal with Hezbollah effectively, and they are doing. And so I think it's really important that Israel be allowed to maintain its forces inside Lebanon, and until such time as they decide that the threat to their own people, their own civilian communities in northern Israel, has been either removed or severely downgraded. But in both cases, in the case of the Houthis in Yemen, in the case of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also in the case of the remnants of Hamas in Gaza, Israel needs to have the flexibility and the ability to deal with these threats without being overly constrained. I think if there's a peace deal with Iran, then Israel will adhere to that. They're not going to, whether they're party to it or not party to it, they're not going to, in my view, defy President Trump if he strikes up a deal with Iran. That's not to say they won't keep very close vigilance on Iran and take whatever action they think they need to take, probably potentially more in the form of covert action, as they've been using against Iran for many years now, rather than overt military action, as we saw in the recent hostilities. So I think the two issues are closely linked: Iran and its proxies. And Israel, for America, America understands the seriousness of the threat from Iran and from the Iranian proxies. But for Israel, they're in the crosshairs. They're the ones who suffer. They're the ones that get missiles fired at them, and they have to be able to defend against that. And they also, I think, while they would feel bound by a ceasefire deal between the United States and Iran, that would not prevent them from taking the action that they would need to take. And I don't think that President Trump would try and seriously constrain that either if he was persuaded that it was necessary action.